Pints with Jack, Season 3, Episode 28. After Hours with Reverend David Beckmann. Good morning and welcome to Pints with Jack, a podcast where two enthusiastic C.S. Lewis amateurs get together, share a beverage, and discuss a work of C.S. Lewis. And this season we're discussing Till We Have Faces. But today is an After Hours episode, and so rather than having Matt here, I'm joined by Reverend David Beckmann, who's just released a short book entitled Life with the Professor, The True Story Behind the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's a book about Lewis, his home, and the evacuees who came to stay with him during World War II. Reverend David Beckmann is a priest in the Anglican Church of North America. He is currently the executive director of the Christian Study Center of Chattanooga and is a former director of the C.S. Lewis Study Center at the Kilns in Oxford, England. He was the moderator of the C.S. Lewis Society of Chattanooga for many years and is a regional representative of the C.S. Lewis Foundation. A native Chattanoogan, he earned his B.A. at the University of South Carolina in history, and he holds an M.Div. degree, magna cum laude, from the Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis. Reverend Beckmann blogs at revbeckman.com and cslewis.org. Reverend Beckmann, welcome to Pints with Jack.
Well, thank you for having me, David.
And this is actually the second time that we're speaking, because the first time we were halfway through a delightful conversation and my computer decided to shut down and save nothing.
Yeah, so we will endure all things.
Yes, and I think my pronunciation of Chattanooga is much better this time. The first time through, I kept tripping up over it.
It definitely has improved. I think you've gotten there now.
Well, it's the middle of my workday, so I can't really have scotch, at least not yet, or at least I'm not going to admit it if I am. But I'm instead having a cup of red rooster tea. Are you drinking anything?
Yes, that's lovely. I am having Yorkshire Gold in my Oxford University mug.
Yorkshire Gold, for the uninitiated, Yorkshire Gold is amazing. It's tea that will put hair on your chest.
There you go.
So that was the drink of the week, and for the quote of the week, I have a short extract from On 3 Ways of Writing for Children. Lewis wrote, I am almost inclined to set up as canon that a children's story which is enjoyed only by children is a bad children's story. And so with that, cheers.
Cheers. Very nice. With a little milk and sweetener.
I will allow the milk. I would go for real sugar personally, but when I was a kid, my mother wouldn't let us put sugar in our tea except when I went to other people's houses.
Okay.
So that was when I went crazy.
Okay. Right.
How did you first discover Lewis? What kind of role has he played in your life and in your spiritual journey?
Well, Dave, I have to think back a good while back to my college days in the 1970s, but I really believe that what happened was I heard about Lewis through InterVarsity and Campus Crusade conferences that I attended. They would have book tables there, and I've got books. I know that from the dates and the condition, just my memory, I'm pretty sure I bought them off of those book tables. And Screw Tape Letters, Mere Christianity, Problem of Pain, all the real classics. And my faith was challenged a good bit in college, and so I was very hungry for things to help me to develop a Christian mind and to think intellectually about the Christian faith. And Lewis was just a real blessing to me. I really appreciated him, and then of course after that came Narnia and all the rest of it, and I've just loved Lewis ever since.
So you came to Narnia after his apologetics works?
Yes, that's correct. I know people come through Lewis all kinds of different ways, but that was my path.
But at some point, your relationship with Lewis got kind of serious because you became the director of the C.S. Lewis Study Center at the Kilns. How did that come about?
Well, the short story is that I was teaching at the University of Tennessee and at a local Christian school, and for different reasons, I lost those positions, and my wife started praying that God would just have somebody call me on the phone and offer me a job. And so the current director at the Kilns called me on the phone and offered me the job.
Nice. I think I might ask your wife to pray that I get that job, because that sounds like an awful lot of fun.
But of course, she was a good friend of ours. We had visited her at the Kilns and had known her for a number of years. And we were connected with the C.S. Lewis Foundation indirectly. So a number of things just came together. It was, what people call a God thing. But initially I said no, because we were expecting our third grandchild, and I just could not conceive of taking my wife to England when we had this child coming. But everybody said, "You've got to do this." And so we did. I gave in.
You have good friends. Now, you just released your book, Life with the Professor, the true story behind The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. What was it that motivated you to write this book, and now?
Well, part of it is I love the story. I love all things Britain during World War II, and with my connection with the kilns and with Lewis and so forth, this was something that I was naturally interested in. But I also presented this material at one of the Taylor University colloquiums about C.S. Lewis, and one of the folks that was there asked if I had anything in print about it, and I didn't. And I thought, well, maybe I should do that. And it's taken a while, but I finally did. And I actually sent a proof copy to that person, just to show her influence. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I visited the kilns, and as I was reading your book, it really struck me that it would be really good preparatory reading for any tourists preparing to visit Lewis's home or to read afterwards.
Yes, it introduces you to the house itself. I mean, there's things, if you have a knowledgeable tour guide at the kilns, which hopefully you would have, it does introduce you to a lot of the background of the kilns, but especially the World War II era, which is leads right up to the composition of the Narnian Chronicles, which was which followed immediately after the war. So I think it's a fun book myself. And
it was a very quick read. I got through it practically, I think, in 2 sittings. It was 2 pots of tea, I think.
It is short. It is short.
Now, what were your sources of information when you were writing this book? What were your primary sources?
Well, as I say in the preface, pretty much all the biographies of Lewis will at least mention the evacuees from London during World War II. And some of them will talk about, that is, some of the biographers will talk about some of them and the others. But there's not been a place where all the available information has been gathered together so that you've got the full story with the chronology, some research done. And also, one of the evacuees is a rather famous lady named Lady Jill Freud, and I was able to get in touch with her, and she was happy to answer all my questions. So there was that. Also, a fun thing that happened was while I was the director there at the kilns, I wanted to set up Lewis's post-war office. The way it looks in the pictures that we have of him writing at his desk. Mm-hmm. So I put a desk there right in this place where it was in the room, and I tried to find objects that are in the picture and arrange them properly, and I got books and things. And then I came across a file that had the first volume of the New York Society, C.S. Lewis Society's newsletter in it, and there was a letter from one of the evacuees talking about her time. And I thought, oh, well, that's great. I did find that elsewhere later on and printed another book, and I provide references for all that. But the point of the matter is, it's just stuff I've been collecting over last few years.
And let's talk about the book's dedication. Who is it dedicated to, and why is she called The Glory of the Kilns?
The book is dedicated to Lady Jill Freud, who is the evacuee that I mentioned earlier. She's the one that the biographers tend to mention because she had, well, I don't say. Yeah, I would say it's because, first of all, she's famous as an actress. She was married to the son of Sigmund Freud, Sir Clement Freud, who was a big BBC TV personality over in England. So there's that aspect of it. But she's also been happy to talk about her experience through the years. She's had some articles. She's been interviewed. She's been on, some television things and so forth. And so she was. She's been identified with that period of time. And the thing is that she was very helpful to me in producing the book. But the main factor is the appreciation that Lewis and his brother Warnie had for her. Her name back then was June Fluitt. I tell in the book about the change of her name. But she came there as an evacuee, but she saw how much they needed her, and so she stayed on beyond she got permission from her parents to stay on, and she was there for about 2 years or so, there to the end of the war. And in fact, the Lewis brothers had to write to her family to encourage them to get her to leave and go back to school because otherwise she wasn't going to go. And I came across a letter in the Taylor University letter collection of C.S. Lewis where he was writing to her mother after she had returned home. And he said at the end of the letter, Ichabod, Ichabod, we are the ruin of a house. And of course, Ichabod means the glory has departed. So Lewis was calling her the glory of the Kilns. And so I dedicated it to her because of their appreciation of her. She's one of the evacuees. She was helpful to me, and also to honor her as I think Lewis and Warnie would like.
And wasn't she also at least the partial inspiration for Lucy Pevensey?
Yes, Douglas Gresham told her that, and she was very impressed by that. She was she's a rather humorous person, and she did say something along the lines of, "I just can't imagine people thinking that this elderly lady, she's not that elderly, but this older lady is the inspiration for this little girl, you know." But that was quite all right. I'm sure she was honored by it.
And I think probably going forward, can you just talk us through how your book is structured? What kind of areas do you talk about?
Right. It's pretty chronological from around 1930 to 1945. I talk about the acquisition of the house in 1930. And then as I get into the war, I talk about people that are living in the house during the war. I talk about the evacuees as they came and went because they came in different sets at different times. And then I just have some observations that I've made on Lewis's relationship with the girls.
Okay, then let's start with the house itself. What can you tell us about Jack's home in Oxford?
Well, it's something of a sprawling bungalow. It's brick house, tiled roof, very much the period house with, it was built around 1922. We don't know who built it, but it was built at that time. So it had a lot of the more middle class sort of aspects to it. At the time when they bought it, it was out in the countryside, which is one of the reasons why Lewis and his brother Warnie liked it so much, because they wanted to get away from town. They wanted to have their privacy and so forth. It is kind of sprawling, but it's not as big as the house that is depicted in The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. That's a much larger house, which we think is Lewis was probably basing that on the house Little Lee that he had grown up in himself back in Ireland. But you can imagine the kids running around in the place. It is 2-story, but everything's mostly on the ground floor. So one of the good things about the house, I don't know if we were going to talk about this later, but I can probably go ahead and put this in now, is the fact that after Lewis's brother Warnie died and the house was sold, the people that moved into the house updated it in 1970s fashion.
Ugh.
So in came the orange shag carpet, and the fireplaces were closed up, and electric heaters came in, and old windows went out, and it was abominable. But they retired from Oxford, and the house went on the market, and Americans got hold of the house, and it eventually was in the hands of the C.S. Lewis Foundation, and people would take their time in the summers, free time in the summers, to go over, and Americans, because the British don't care about the house, but that's another story. And they went over and fixed it up the way it made it habitable again, and made it look like it did as best they could back in the days when the Lewises lived there. And so it's a real treat to visit the place. People come from all over the world.
Yeah, when I first walked in there, it smelled like my grandparents' house. Everything just seemed very familiar. And I really liked, as I was going through your book, because you include some blueprints of the floor plans. And so I closed my eyes and walk through the house as I remembered it. And I did chuckle when I saw words like larder and scullery. And I was reading it on the couch, and my housemates were in the living room. And so I polled them. Did they know what these words meant? And it seemed entirely determined by what kind of books they had read. And unfortunately, like Eustace Scrubb, many of them hadn't read the right sort of books.
Yes, that'll happen.
I remember in our tour, there was a story of some Russian tourist falling through the ceiling.
Oh, yes.
because they were told not to go into the attic part, and
Yeah, they went into the attic.
too enthusiastic.
Yes, there's all kinds of interesting stories like that.
The one that really sticks out to me is the fact that when you go upstairs, you have to walk through Mrs. Moore's room in order to get to Jack's room. So what they did is they shut it, locked it, and he would climb out the window when he needed to leave or go to the bathroom in the middle of the night.
Right, yes. Yeah, well, that was the deal. And Lewis, he was happy to just take the window there and cut a hole in the wall and put a door and climb up and down a ladder initially, and then go in underneath the house there to the tradesman's entrance, which today it's enclosed, but in those days it was an open breezeway, and you used the toilet down there, and the winter wind came blowing under the door. But later on, he put in a fire escape like a staircase just outside of the door so he could go up and down. And that's just the way he lived. So if he wanted to go to his bedroom, he had to go out the door and walk around the side of the house and go up the stairs to get into his bedroom.
And apparently it stayed like that long after Mrs. Moore was gone. Apparently it was an argument that he had with Joy because they had lost the key and he was still climbing through the window.
Well, the guys didn't pay any attention to the house. Once something was done, it was done. They weren't going to fix it or change it.
Well, on that point, I hadn't realized that when Jack and Warnie went to go and look at the house, they didn't actually look at the house. They went to the pond, they walked around the area, and it's like, oh, yes, and there's a house there as well. We don't need to go inside.
Right. Well, actually, those two guys being who they were, I think if they went in the house, they wouldn't have known whether it was a good house or not. Thankfully, it was fairly new. It was only about 8 years old by that time. So if there were any problems, it shouldn't have been too serious. But they were just captivated by the countryside and the beauty of the property because it came with 9 acres. And so that's what really won their hearts to the location.
And that was actually one of the other shocks to me when I went to visit, because all of the pictures I had seen of the kilns were of the kilns surrounded by empty fields. But when I went there, it was quite a built-up area.
Yes, well, what happened was not long after they moved in, probably much to their disappointment, the Cowley car plant was built in South Oxford, where the Morris car and the Minis were made. And also during the war, military vehicles were made, and their gardener would have to go down there and work in the plant. And so to accommodate workers, a good bit of the countryside behind the house was filled with semi-detached houses. And so it wasn't long after they moved in that the neighborhood did change. They still had the rustic feel with their acreage and so forth. Sadly, after Lewis died, Warnie was worried about having enough money, which was totally crazy, but he had this irrational fear he'd inherited from his dad. And so he sold off the property around the house, and I think it was in 1968, a developer came in, put the current Lewis Close in, and built the houses around the kilns, and totally changed it. And Warnie, after it happened, deeply regretted that he had done that. So that's why it looks like it does today.
Now, you mentioned Warnie, you've mentioned the gardener. Who else was involved in the house?
All right. Well, very key to this, we have to go back to the Great War when Lewis promised a soldier buddy of his that if something happened to him, he would take care of his mom and his sister. His friend died, and so Lewis, after the war, he arranged things with this lady. Her name was Mrs. Janie Moore. Her daughter was Maureen Moore, and they would put their monies together and so forth and arrange their living accommodations so that Lewis was able to live with them and take care of them and help them. And though they might move around a little bit here and there, they were always together. And what happened was Warnie was going to retire from the Army, and he was going to, and this was in the 30s, and he was going to want to live with them, and they wanted him to be able to live with them, but none of the flats that they were renting had enough space, and so that's what motivated them. Actually, that would have been in the late 20s because, Warnie was going to retire in the 30s, but they hadn't bought the house yet, and they bought it in September of 1930. So they went looking for the house. And as Lewis had promised to take care of Mrs. Moore, when they did pool their funds with Mrs. Moore's funds as well and bought the house, he put it in Mrs. Moore's name, with her daughter to inherit. Jack and his brother Warnie had the right to live there for the rest of their lives. But that legal arrangement is just another indication of how he was taking care of them. So in the house, you've got the two Lewis brothers. You've got Mrs. Moore and Maureen, though she, after a year into the war, she marries a music teacher at Malvern College, the Lewis's alma mater. And so she's living away, but she's coming back a lot, to see her mother and so forth. Then there is the gardener, Fred Paxford. There's the ladies that would live there and help out with cooking and housework, and they were, several of them at different times. And then, of course, once the war started, the evacuees were there.
But in your book, you also talk about there being lots and lots of animals: dogs, cats, hens, rabbits.
Yes, there were, and it was a good thing because with the war and rationing hit, to have a couple dozen chickens and some rabbits was a very beneficial thing for them to have. Lewis, of course, loved animals. When you see the animals at St. Anne's and that hideous strength, I think that reflects a lot of the life at the kilns because animals were always around. And Mrs. Moore had a particular dog she liked that Lewis had to walk all the time, and I think he was relieved when the dog passed away. But anyway, he loved animals, and not just the domesticated animals, but the wild animals around there as well.
When I went to go and visit, I arrived a little early and went walking through those woods, and I kept a sharp eye out for fawns, but didn't see any, unfortunately. Next time. And so then the evacuees start turning up. So where were they coming from?
All right, well, these were children that were being evacuated from London during World War II. If you remember the opening scenes of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that's exactly what was happening. And in fact, the British government, since London had been bombed by the Germans in World War I, they were anticipating that if war did break out, that the same thing would happen again. And so they already had arrangements to get over 1 million children out of the city into the surrounding countryside, even before war was declared. And in fact, they initiated what they called Operation Pied Piper the day before war was declared. And so students were arriving at the house as Warnie was walking out the door to reassume a position in the army to fight in France. So they're there for the safety of their lives, to protect them from the German bombs. And it just so happens that now Mrs. Moore, it was her house, as I've already said. So she was the one that was arranging who would come, and she would interview the girls, and the girls really liked her. She apparently was very nice to them, and they came by class. These in this particular case, at least around Oxford, it seems that the authorities arranged for students to come from schools in London by class, and so apparently not just apparently, I know that when the class was out of session, that they would go back to London. Why, I don't know.
Yeah, that really surprised me when you mentioned that in the book.
Yeah, and one of them perished with her family there. But Mrs. Moore would interview them, and she would approve who would be there. And so she's kind of the Mrs. McCreary. McCreary, is that the name?
Yes.
Of the story here. Mm-hmm.
But apparently a little bit nicer.
Yes, definitely.
And you also mentioned that they seem to have been drawn almost exclusively from Roman Catholic schools.
Yes, and I don't know why, but that is the case. And so there were a couple of Roman Catholic schools in the area, and they would go to class, and Lewis would help them with their homework, and so that's how it was organized. It wasn't a matter of parents in London trying to find somebody to take their kids, but the government organized this thing through their schools. And since they were coming in class, I mean, the Lewises would only have just a few of them there. Some of their classmates stayed with the Tolkiens, and so they would go over to the Tolkiens and play together and that kind of thing.
And did they move them when they graduated to a new year at school? Because there seem to be a lot of kids that have went through the kilns over the time of the war.
Yes, that kind of thing did happen. Right. Yeah. As the school went, that had a big part of where they would be staying and how long and so forth.
Hmm. And so, what do we know about life at the kilns? What was it like living with Lewis and Mrs. Moore?
Yes. Well, if you were warning, you'd probably feel as a bit miserable. But the kids loved it. They had a blast. They could swim in the lake. They could play tennis. There, of course, play with the chickens or the rabbits or whatever. Lewis would take them on walks and tell them stories. He'd take them into town. And also, if he thought Mrs. Moore was being a little bit stingy with the food, he'd sneak them over to the Six Bells pub just down the road and buy them fish and chips and be sure that they had licked their fingers clean and everything before they walked back in the house so Mrs. Moore wouldn't know about it. So yeah, they had a great time. They said that they were being spoiled. One of them said, "I got fat." It was they were doing well. And the older ones, and this is something that I really enjoyed learning about. The older girls, Lewis would take them into town because there were some difference in ages at times, and Lewis was being sensitive to that. And so the older girls he would take into town and introduce to his friends. And we're talking about, Tolkien and these other guys, and one of the delights they had too was he just said, if you want any books at Blackwell's, just go in there and put it on my tab, that sort of thing. So, at any rate, if you go to the website that I recommend in the book about the history of the story of the evacuees in England, a lot of them suffered a lot. They had a hard time. Now, they enjoyed being out in the rural countryside, but seems like there were a good number of heads of households that just were not sympathetic with children. Maybe didn't even like them, whatever. So there was a lot of kids had a hard time. So the students staying in Oxford with the Lewises were very fortunate indeed.
And that's one of the things I particularly liked about your book, because it helps battle the image that movies and plays like The Shadowlands, they portray Lewis as this stoic creature that doesn't like small people at all, that is aloof. But your book paints quite a different picture. Yes, indeed.
Yes. It is true that Lewis did not think of himself as, being able to do anything with children. He thought that they just weren't for him or whatever. But these kids show up in the house, and he uses the word delightful. He says, "This is great." And he got really liking them, caring for them, having compassion on them, and he was a very warm character anyway. He just had not been around kids that much. So he was warm with the kids when they showed up.
So in that case, what kind of impact did they have on him?
I think that's an important question. There's a story that's told that he came down the stairs one day and Mrs. Moore and Maureen were in the dining room. When you come down the stairs, you just go around the corner and there's the dining room. He says, "I'm going to write a book for children." And they laughed because it's like, yeah, sure. But by that time, he had just gotten such a heart for children. And while we recognize that he had a number of reasons for writing the Narnia books, I argue, and there are some other people who have indicated this before, that he just got a heart for children during the war, and so there was that personal side of it, that warm personal side of things, caring about kids.
Mm. And you also noted in your book that when they said that they were bored, he saw that as almost a flaw in their imaginative capabilities.
Yes. Yeah, he felt sorry for them. And he would write to people about them and talk about how they have no imagination. When we were kids, we would go out and we would do this, or we would go up in our little room and we would make our stories and draw our pictures and stuff. And when Maureen was home, they would go to her. She would, "What can we do? What should we do?" And then she would say, "Well, go out and do this." And they would go out and do that. And then they'd come back, "Well, what else can we do now? We're bored." And Lewis saw all this going on. And so and this is the thing, Lewis was extremely busy during the war. The war wore him out. He's traveling around the RAF bases. He's traveling to London to record at the BBC. He's teaching, he's grading, he's taking care of Mrs. Moore's dog. He's doing all these things. And then he has these children in the house. but sacrificially, because he was concerned about them, he took them on as a project, so to speak. And so he would take them for walks and tell them stories, hoping that it would help their imaginations, because he knew how important the imagination is for lots of different reasons, not just so that kids will know what to do with their time, but for their adult life as well. So, it's a picture of Lewis being a sacrificial, loving Christian man to these kids.
Well, I'm particularly glad that as a result of all of this, we then got the Chronicles of Narnia, and I know my parents are very grateful to him for solving the question when I went to them and said, "I'm bored, what should I do?" It's like, here is a book, go read it quietly.
Excellent. That's great, yeah.
Well, Reverend Beckman, thank you so much for coming on the show today and talking with us.
Oh, it's delightful.
As we wrap up, could you please tell us where people can get your book, as well as where they can go online to find out more about you and your work?
Yeah. Well, you can find the book on Amazon, amazon.com for the US, .co.uk in England. If you search for it, put in the title, Life with the Professor, and then put my last name in there with two N's on the end, Beckmann, and it should pop up. By the way, the title "Life with the Professor," Lewis was known as the professor in the neighborhood. That's what they called him, and so he's the professor, as he was a real life professor, like he was in the books. And then, as for myself personally, and also links to the book as well, my website, as you had mentioned, revbeckman.com, all one word, REV as in Victor, BECKMANN.com, and they can find me there.
And I'll put links to all of those in the show notes. Is there an electronic version of your book going to come out? Because at the moment I only see a paperback edition.
Yes, there's just a paperback right now. I've got to do the work to get a Kindle version going. I intend to have a Kindle version. But right now I'm charging the least amount of money that Amazon will let me do for the book. So.
Oh yeah, it was a bargain. It was $5.
Indeed.
Well, thank you again. And listeners, please join us next Tuesday, when we'll be going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.